I was born in Thompson, Georgia, down about 134 miles from here. Born about 9 miles and a half from this little town, between the two creeks, they call it, Little Bry and Big Bry.
A few miles outside Thompson, deep in the farming country of Middle Georgia, the year is 1901, the month of May. He's born blind, and because he will come to know his name by ear and in the distinct local accent, McTeer will become McTell, so that one day Willie Samuel McTeer will call himself McTell, Blind Willie McTell. He was an outside child, born out of wedlock to Minnie Watkins, all of 14, and Eddie McTeer, a gambler and moonshiner. A few months after the baby was born, Eddie was gone. Minnie moved a few miles south to the tiny hamlet of Stapleton, keeping the McTeer name for her baby and herself. Country life had drifted along in slow motion through the last decades of the 19th century, but it was motion all the same.
Because freedom was now reality and not future possibility, many slaves, ex-slaves, left plantations looking for what they thought was their piece of land. Many of them also were looking very, very hard for members of families that had been taken away during that particular period. So there was a great deal of movement throughout the South as people began to seek that particular spot that they wanted to settle upon or to find family and bring them back together again. After the turn of the century, we're past post-Reconstruction. There's a re-intensification of racial oppression in the South in particular. And I say in the South in particular because it was also occurring in the North. And what we begin to find is that the desire for better jobs, more economic opportunity, and a less oppressive social environment was probably the combination that inspired many African Americans to get on the road, to go somewhere else. In that process, you had people for the first time being alone for long periods of time as opposed to having been thrust together as a working body. And so the field, holler, and call became much more prominent. And an example I can think of is Wylock's Moan in terms of the lone singer bouncing off him or herself. Why don't you come here, black woman? Sit down on daddy's knee. Mm-hmm. Why don't you come here, black woman? Sit down on daddy's knee. Mm-hmm. And so after a while, you just add your own words, but that mm-hmm is what eventually evolves into what the guitar does. Okay, so when you have an instrumentation, the answer comes from the instrument, not from voice generally, okay? And so we see that evolution of the singing and the instrumentation becoming one seamless musical activity.
Change was coming. Those who had known slavery firsthand were dying off, and memories of that world were fading into shadow. The post-war years had produced minstrel troupes that featured banjo-plucking, razor-toting darkies as their stars. They created a body of music, coon songs, that offered up the same crude stereotypes. For much of America, this was the psalm of black music as the turn of the century approached. But the black troops turned away from the caricatures, leaving only white imitators, and the banjo, the popular instrument of African origin, fell into disrepute. But there were echoes just over the horizon. Scott Joplin turned placid parlor piano into the bubbling energy of ragtime, and in New Orleans, Buddy Bolden was blowing the first hot notes of the music they called jazz. And along the Mississippi Delta and in East Texas And at country crossroads in Georgia and the Carolinas, a new music was ready to make its entrance. But first the stage had to be set. After the economic panic in 1893, J.P. Morgan monopolized Southern railroads and soon had the South entwined in a web of steel rail. At the same time, the U.S. Postal Service was expanding the new rural free delivery and parcel post systems from 38 RFD routes 4 years before Willie McTell's birth to 38,000 of them by the time he was 6. This in turn made it possible for Sears Roebuck to dominate the new mail order industry. By 1900, the Sears catalog was a fixture in every rural home. Their country folk found pages filled with guitars, the popular instruments that had made their way north from Mexico and across the ocean from Southern Europe and into 19th century American parlors. They were cheap and seemed easy to play. When a minor guitar craze faded, the instruments found their way into black hands. It was the guitar that gave backing to the music that was rising from the farm fields and along the dirt roads and in small towns across the South.
To play the guitar in the old days, to do old-fashioned picking, and they used to call it old-fashioned picking, you would have to play the guitar just like it was a piano. One hand is our thumb, and this will be the left hand of the piano player. The left hand is usually going like this on a piano, going boom, chick, boom, chick. And in English, it's interesting because it's not going boom, boom. It's usually playing one note and then a chord. So the actual sound is a boom and a heavier sound, chick, which actually leads into it being dance music, boom, chick. So with our thumb, we go alternate the bass on the guitar, and we're going to play, for instance, here the 6th and the 4th string. And instead of just going boom, boom, I actually get a heavier backbeat going. So that's one hand. Obviously, the second hand is the hand that's playing the chords. And then the third hand is just the little old index finger is playing melody lines, what the right hand usually plays on the piano. So whereas a piano player is going like this, and with his hand tinkling away, you have the guitar playing this piano-based music. And then from there, in this old-fashioned picking, it sort of developed as dance styles changed.
I grew up there till I was 9 years old. My mother left there and went down Bullock County.
It was this music, this blues, that 9-year-old Willie McTell heard when his mother moved them to Statesboro, a small city to the south. It was this blues that he heard on the streets, at the Saturday markets and country fairs, and when the medicine shows came to town. And on Sunday, he still heard the deep gospel of a Baptist church. It was in Statesboro that he first picked up a 6-string guitar. From then on, he was never without it.
Stayed there till I run away. And I run away and went everywhere I could go without any money. I followed shows all around till I began to get grown.
He wanted to play music, so he ran off with the medicine show, known as erstwhile training academies for young players. He spent his teenage years on the byways of the Southeast. Music was surging forward.
About 1910, 1915, you would have this type of music. Now, if you watch that thumb, it's just doing that alternating bass. And this is very reminiscent of the way John Hurt would play. About the 20s, a man called Blind Blake comes along and makes some incredibly popular records for Paramount Race Records. And he's, instead of going boom, chick, the Charleston was really popular. So he starts to, what Reverend Davis would say, he had a sporting right hand. And he would sort of jump that bass. Really trying to exaggerate for you now so you can hear that. really went to town on it. And he was a very influential guitar player, especially to the blues people, the guitar players from the Atlanta area, from the Carolina area, the Georgia area. That whole Piedmont area, Blind Blake was the real governor, the Eric Clapton, if you will, of that style.
His mother married and had a son, Willie's half-brother. He came back to Statesboro and to Thompson, as he would throughout his life, but he would not truly come home for a long time.
My mother, she died and left in 1920. But, and after then I got on my own. I could go anywhere I wanted then, without letting anybody know where I was. I didn't have nobody to write back to. But a brother, 3 years old, and he wasn't able to understand.
After Minnie was gone, Willie drifted. For a short while, he put down his guitar to make moonshine in South Georgia. In the early 20s, a Statesboro neighbor paid his way to the blind school in Macon. From there, he went on to blind schools in Michigan and New York. When he came back to Georgia in 1924, he was swept up in a wave of motion that was general across the South. Farm work had supported most of the black population, and black farm ownership had grown steadily until 1920, when the boll weevil all but destroyed the South's single crop farming. Black families had to leave the land. Most would never return.
Many people think, well, they left the South and went to the North. But actually, many of them left the South and went to the South. In other words, they left the small country areas or rural areas where they were working on farm and moved to towns and cities in the South. And so you find people moving from the Mississippi Delta area into areas like Memphis and Chattanooga, Tennessee. You find people moving from the rural areas of Georgia into Atlanta.
Willie McTell followed his audience into a city he had visited in his travels, a city where he heard there was a market for the blues. Thompson had been his birthplace, Statesboro his hometown, but Atlanta would be his stage.
Out in Atlanta on Harris Street, that's where the boys and gals do meet, doing that rag, that Georgia rag. Out in the alley, in the street, every little kid that you meet, doing that rag, that old Georgia rag. Spank that Georgia rag, boy.
The city was a magnet, then as now, the hub of the Southeast, the richest metropolis in the region. When the land fell, black families migrated there in droves, carried forward by optimism or driven by desperation. The flood of humanity doubled the city's population in a single decade. For blacks in the Southeast, Atlanta was a Mecca. At least that was the image. In reality, the city was neither a haven of opportunity nor a sanctuary from racism. The flood of migrants from the country frightened whites, and the Ku Klux Klan, feeding on these fears, became active in politics. Klan influence reached into the mayor's office, the governor's mansion, and the state senate. The city affected a blueprint for segregation. Blacks were forced into neighborhoods like the one that ran from Decatur Street to Auburn Avenue and from Peachtree Street to Boulevard. In the 1920s, these 10 square blocks featured the poorest housing, the highest number of relief cases, and the worst crime rate in the city. But it was also the stomping ground of the Atlanta blues musicians, especially Decatur Street, a busy boulevard crammed with stores and theaters and barbershops and other more marginal enterprises. It was there that the black community came for entertainment, to a moving stage where songsters plied their trade day and night, inside and out. Atlanta's street music became a small industry with the appearance of the record companies. Edison's phonographs were now within everyone's means, and the companies were hungry for talent to fill up their fat 78 RPM race records. Atlanta became a recording center for both blues and country musicians. In quick succession, players like Peg Leg Howell, Eddie Anthony, Bob and Charlie Hicks, and Fred McMullen turned that blues sides for RCA Victor, Paramount, and a dozen other labels. Willie McTell spent his first year there playing the streets and house parties and the occasional afternoon show reserved for blacks at the 81 Theater. And Sunday mornings find him singing at Mount Zion Baptist Church. In 1927, McTell made his first recording for the Victor label. He would record at least once a year for the next 9 years. He cut records for Victor and OK and Columbia. He used monikers like Blind Sammy and Hot Shot Willie and Georgia Bill to dance around contracts. Everyone did it. Over the next 7 years, he would lay down over 80 sides for 8 different labels. Among those sides were his classics.
Turn your lamp down low. Have you got the nerve to drive Papa McTell from your door?
He was a singular talent, and no one echoed and reflected Atlanta's patchwork energy like Willie McTell. He was based in the rag-Tommy Piedmont style, and he borrowed from Lemon Jefferson's field holler voice and guitar, from rag masters like Blind Blake and Blind Boy Fuller, from the Delta progenitors like Charlie Patton, and from the impassioned spirituality of Blind Willie Johnson. He borrowed from all but copied none in forging a style completely his own. He made his music even more unique with the 12-string guitar that he picked up and turned into his trademark.
Now that's not note for note what Blind Willie McTell was playing, but it gives you an idea. It's sort of that alternating bass is very ragtimey, and using a 12-string, he can get away with just strumming the guitar with a very dynamic sound. Again, I'm not going to play this note for note the way McTell did it, but you have things like in the key of C. Simple accompaniments. Again, the 12-string allows him to be simple because it's such a massively sounding instrument. It has so much sound involved. But he has a lot of tunes that he does pick a lot on. His famous tune, Statesboro Blues, we go down to what I call a drop D tune. We're talking amazing sound. And he has a lick. Tune, at one point he goes, when he's talking about tell his mother, tell his brother, tell his sister. That's playing the piano. That's just playing octaves. As a piano player would do that in his left hand, playing octaves on the guitar. It looked like this. You couldn't get away with on a 6-string. It sounded too empty. It would sound too nude, whereas on 12, it has a lot of body.
McTell was busy playing, recording, and traveling. He was working his way to the top of the rough and tumble blues world. But just as he moved within reach of the brass ring, dark clouds arose. Wall Street came crashing down, and the tremors rippled outward, even to the fledgling record industry. Within a few years, Atlanta's recording business would drift off to Memphis and Nashville and New Orleans, and most of the local bluesmen would hang up their guitars. Like McTell, they saw their chances for fame and fortune crumble under the heavy hand of the Depression. But songster to the core, he simply went back to work. He continued to perfect his voice and guitar, but there were always able musicians around. What truly set him apart was the way he used the minstrel's craft to weave his own songs.
The stories that came up, the poetry, Sometimes it's not necessarily the music per se, but what's being played, how it's being played, what are the political ramifications of this, what is the content of the song itself, you know, what are the circumstances to which this song came to light under, you know. Anybody can be a dilettante lifting up the pots in the kitchen on the stove and say, oh, I have a little bit of this, I have a little bit of that, oh, I'll smell some of this, or I'll check out, oh, I don't like them chitlins today. You know, I mean, you can do all that kind of stuff, but there's another thing to, to see what the total value of these things are. And Tell, brought to mind through what he was singing about what it was like to be here at that time, moving around Atlanta, Statesboro, Winsboro, wherever he was moving, because it's obvious he rambled around here and there, I mean, it's like, it still kills me. Big 80 left Savannah, would not stop. You ought to see that colored fireman when he got the boys out talking about reach over in the corner, mama, honey, bring in my traveling shoes. I mean, I had to sit down and say, wow, this cat is like, and all that work, when you think about it, the way he laid it out, nobody else sings it like that. No matter, I mean, he seems to me, what's interesting, this is my personal opinion. My personal opinion is that better than all men singing the blues is women singing the blues. Women can sing the blues much better than a man can. I'm sorry. I know a lot of cats just don't want to hear that because, see, what they did is they transferred it to being a guitar cutting contest as opposed to a singing contest. On singing and emotion alone, a woman can sing the blues. A woman can sing the blues without piano, guitar, whatever you want. And McTell's vocal style was much more closer than the way women sing the blues, with a lot of little notes in between that your ear passes up the first time around listening to them. But after you listen to them, then 10, 15, 20 years later, going back and listening again, you realize that you only got the outside of the song. You didn't hear the inside of it. And that was another thing that was interesting. And also, too, he had a very high, kind of a sharp, crisp voice. Most everybody associate the blues being sung way down here. You know what I mean? And McTell was way up here, And as a matter of fact, there's one tone where the first line he sings something, he says something about, if you don't do something, mama, I won't trouble you no more. And he puts the R correctly in there, and then he realizes in the middle of it, I don't know who's listening to this, but the next line, he comes out and says, no mo. He's funny. He's a funny guy. He knew how to move around, get out of people's way if they're going to get in trouble, or he had some thought about it. He's an interesting man.
With most of McTell's tunes, especially the early ones, you have a feeling that he was a musician who wrote his own music. And most bluesmen, you don't get that feeling. You get the feeling that they're playing a tune that's a dance tune, and they're just putting together a collective consciousness of verses, and out comes a blues. Or they may be singing about an event, the high water everywhere, they're talking about the floods in Mississippi. McTell did that. He spoke about topical events, so he was, in a way, like a Bob Dylan of his day, talking about what was happening. Those were original tunes. He would sing folk songs like the Delias, but very rarely was he singing songs, cover versions, that other blues musicians were doing, very rarely. Yet, he comes from Atlanta, Georgia, which had a wonderful scene of blues players, Barbecue Bob, Charlie Lincoln, George Carter, who no one knows really who he is, Buddy Morse, and Curly Weaver as well. And you don't find the tunes of those musicians in the repertoire of McTell except for Broke Down Engine. He's playing single string lines. Then after that, with McTell's playing as it goes on in his later part of his recording career, he tends to stay away from picking lonesome sounding music and getting more into the ragtime, that same dance type of material.
Over the next few years, he traveled far and wide, always the Rambler. Though he would for the rest of his life consider Atlanta his home base, he ranged from the Mississippi to Miami. For all his travels, McTell had never recorded outside the makeshift Atlanta studios. Then, in September of 1933, he, Buddy Moss, and Curly Weaver went to New York to cut some sides for Battalion. A few months after returning to Atlanta, McTell met Ruth Kate Williams. She was from Rennes, just a few miles from Thompson. In fact, their mothers had been friends, and Willie had jokingly asked for Kate's hand in 1918 when she was only 4 and he was 17. They met now, some 15 years later, when Willie played at Payne College in Augusta, where Kate was attending high school.
I think I was maybe 10-year-old. This was about 1933. My sister brought him home to our surprise as her boyfriend, soon to be her husband. My father was a rural Baptist preacher, and one of the conservative kind, I suppose. And when she brought him home and introduced him as a man who played and sang the blues, he had to bring himself around to accepting him, and it was quite an exciting experience. Naturally, we were, as children, we were very excited to know that a man of his ability was coming in the family. And my father had to convince himself, if I could put it this way, that all of us would not be going to hell in case he was around. And of course, it didn't take long to convince my father. He played both spirituals, gospels, along with the blues. And of course, he eventually was not only accepted, but was greatly loved by the whole family.
They settled in Atlanta, and Kate went back for a high school diploma. She sang with him, and they traveled together during the summers. Early in 1935, the McTells, Weaver, and singer Georgia White went to Chicago to record for Decca. None of the 14 sides Willie cut were released. A recording he made later that year in Augusta with Piano Red met the same fate. McTell would not step into a studio again for 14 years. Back in Atlanta, Willie and Kate lived modestly in apartments near downtown.
This was in 1935, to be exact. I can remember I just had my 12th birthday. She was here. My sister Kate was in Grady Nursery School, and he seemed to have had some connections with whatever company it was, making records in Chicago. He wanted very much for me to come and spend the summer with them, and of course, he took pride. When she would go to school in the mornings, he would take me about the city to show me the landmarks and the places of history. And I was always amazed to wonder if we would truly get lost. He would tell me which car to catch. At being able to read, I could tell him what streetcar was passing, and I could read the streets. But never did we seem to be lost anywhere. He took me to the state capitol, which was a memorable place. He took me to the city hall. He took me to the post office. These were both old and new. These were memorable places. He took me to the black university system, and he named the schools as we went through, Marsh Brown, Morehouse Clark. But the thing that would strike me, there were friends he had that would be living in various streets in alleys. Atlanta had a lot of alleys at that time, and he could almost go there without directions. I was always lost, but he was never lost. Every day when she went to school, he would find somewhere to take me, to show me that was of interest. And of course, naturally, he insisted, and my father permitted me to stay with him for a whole year, which was an enjoyable year of my living.
When he wasn't out on the road, Willie spent his nights working the Atlanta streets that he now knew by heart.
Oh yes, he would, many instances, he would let me walk him from 381 Houston Street, that's where we lived. We'd go down 4th Street, which led into Ponce de Leon, and he knew I would not get lost because I only had to change streets one time. And I would walk with him. There was a little stand right on the outside of the building at the parking lot. And he would sit on this little stand. They had a chair and a stand, and I would sit there by him, and people would come and drop nickels, dimes, and sometimes quarters in his guitar. And he would sit there and play until 10, maybe 12 o'clock at night. He would never let me wait with him, however. He would always come home alone, of which I was often concerned. Well, at the time, I was unable to make this keen distinction. How he could play well, let me call it his blues, all of the week, even Saturday night. And on a Sunday morning, he was quite ready to go to church. And he had a keen sense of putting together his own spirituals that came out of experiences. Now then, I know that they were more or less testimonies to some experience or desire. And listening to those songs that he did sing and play, I like to remember one, when I'm gone, when I'm gone to come no more. I know you're going to miss me when I'm gone. This was always a desired song in our religious service. One of the things that always struck me about him, as you can see, he wore a very unique mustache. He shaped that mustache himself. He never allowed a barber to do that. And believe it or not, he did it with a straight razor. The other thing was, in spite of the fact that he was blind, I don't recall ever seeing him with shades on. He was not ashamed of his blindness. Very smooth-skinned and very soft hair. Very, very smooth. The Indian type that was medium brown, always neat. He never allowed himself to believe that he was dressed until he put on his necktie. He taught me how to tie a necktie, believe it or not. And he was very neat in that. He never allowed himself to be laxed in his appearance. He was very, very cautious of that. A medium-sized man, not a big man. And he dressed himself always. He might ask the color one time, and there was something about the touch of his suit. He would know the color the next time. I lived with him, and I've seen him hang his brown, his black, his blue in the closet. And when he went to the closet, if he put them in there, he would always come out with the one that he wanted. And if it was not, he had a keen sense of telling you, this is not my brown, this is not my black, where is it? Very unique.
Work and wanderlust put him on the road in the late 1930s. He traveled as far as Florida and the Georgia Sea Islands. But it was to Statesboro that Willie went most often when he was away from Atlanta, especially during tobacco season. In those long, hot months, tobacco men from all over the South would gather to buy and sell. Willie played for them at the warehouses and at hotels like the Jaco, where they gathered in the evenings.
He mostly come in the tobacco season because he knew they all would like to hear. And they would always meet here to hear him. All of them that wasn't in the hotel here, that knew him, they would come around. He would come to the porch, and would nobody be saying anything because they'd be watching him to see, was he going to come in to the same place, or was he going to pass by? And then he come home and said, and they all go to laughing and say, oh boy, you come, you know we were here, and you always come to the same place. And they all, how you doing? And he would laugh. And he said, they said, how you been getting along? He said, fine, I've been getting along fine. Where you been? Well, I've been up in Atlanta and around. If he knew you, if he heard your voice once or twice and called your name, he could call you a good name. Because he hadn't seen, the first time he saw me, I had never seen him. And the second time he saw me, I said, what's my name? He said, you say it again. What's my name? He said, this is Johnson. I said, yeah, this is Johnson. And he said, you live with Judy Howard? I said, yeah. He said, I know you. I know you. Right out there, right out there, he'd be sitting there on the plane, and all the tobacco men would be around me. He would stay out there about sometime an hour and a half, something like that. Yeah. And they'd all, I can see the big old rocking chairs all pulled up. They'd pull them all from this other side over here to this side to hear him play the guitar. And sometimes he would sit there, and then again he would sit here. most times the bellhops would be standing there on each side, and he would sit here, and we would come on the side and listen, and we'd go back. Sometimes it'd be late in the evening, and we would be coming in, and we would pass out there and stand and listen a little while, and that's the only time we see the mix. So, either they would take a hat and sit it down there by, and every time they'd play a song, they'd put some money in there for me. And then they would, before he leave, they would count and tell him how much he had. But he could count his money. He could count his money. But how he could tell a $1 bill from a $10 bill or $5 bill, I don't know. But he could do it. He could do it. Everybody knew it. Mostly. And then a lot of times the new men come with the tobacco men, and they'd say, I want you to hear it. And they would come, and some of them stayed at other hotels, and they would come and sit there and listen to it. Yeah. So, I think they all enjoyed it. That was really the tobacco season then. Yeah. It was a great difference in it then than it is now. You don't know we have a tobacco season anymore. So I guess it won't be long before we won't have.
1940 found McTell in Atlanta, playing the streets, which is where folklorist John Lomax found him. Lomax, seeking out talent for the Library of Congress, brought McTell to his downtown hotel, where he cut an album worth of blues, ballads, and spirituals. In 1941, Kate received her nursing certificate from Grady Hospital. There were no jobs in Atlanta, so she traveled to New York to visit one of her sisters. She was there on December 7th. She went back to Georgia and got a job at Camp Gordon near Augusta. Willie remained in Atlanta. They stayed apart from then on, except for the times he would visit when he passed through Augusta. The wartime economy brought a flood of money to the South. For a seasoned performer, it should have meant working again as clubs reopened for business. But there was new music in the air. An interest in a solitary singer recounting tales from a murky past was scant. The clubs rarely hired him, and rationing kept recording slow. So he went back to the streets and out on the road.
I think one of the things that he represented was what happened to a lot of musicians at that particular time. You know, they had a few years of enjoying recording and developing their audience, and then a national and international situation came along that because they were ultimately at the bottom of the pile, you know, they were first fired and from the labels, and that meant an awful lot to, you know, that helped them create the lifestyle that they had built up until the point that, you know, these different events, war, etc., you know, the lack of shellac, so forth and so on. And then later on, when the music came, you know, resurfaced again, it resurfaced under different auspices. So, you know, I mean, and there's a lot of people that this happened to. I mean, it went on, it can go on and on and on and on, the amount of people that the same thing happened to. But it's he's, you know, luckily, fortunate for us, we, you know, somebody had the consciousness to record this guy, stay in tune and recording him. It's just unfortunate that his life had to follow the kind of things that it had to because of it.
Willie took up with Helen Edwards from nearby Covington. She began calling herself McTell, though they never married. The war years passed, and McTell was pushed even further from the spotlight as the troops returned with a taste for brash, big band, and sentimental pop music. But there were also some new record labels on the scene. Small companies pursuing blues, gospel, and R&B artists. They looked south.
My brother and I used to go door to door in the ghetto areas of Washington and just knock on the door and say, do you have any records you want to sell? Then we found a lot of records by Blind Lemon Jefferson, who was a very popular artist in his time. And I guess he was a great inspiration for many other blues artists. But Blind Lemon was obviously sold hundreds of thousands of records because
we found a lot of those. Much rarer were the blind Willie Johnson. I'm speaking now about the blind gospel and blues singers. Blind Blake was another one. But blind Willie Johnson was much rarer. But I came across several recordings by blind Willie McTell, who had a peculiarly sweet voice compared to the others, and I was very, very taken by him, so that I had a memory of his sound, and we especially went to the South to find the kind of blues players or musicians who were more in the blues idiom than the New York musicians who were, and the New York singers who were much more sophisticated and had already moved away from the blues. But on the way, when we stopped in Atlanta, one day we were walking in the black section of Atlanta, and which was then, of course, heavily segregated. And there was a beggar on the street corner, and I stopped to listen to him sing. He had a 12-string guitar, and I thought, my God, I wonder who this is. He was a blind man, and I stopped, and we gave him some money. He thanked us because there weren't a lot of people putting money in his cup, and I said, have you ever heard of blind Willie McTell? So he said, I am blind Willie McTell. And I couldn't believe it. And of course then he said, how are the people at I said, I'm from a record company. He said, oh really? He says, how's everybody at RCA Victor? I said, no, it's a different record company. It's a new small record company. And he didn't think that there was any other record company. And I said that we'd like to record him. And we stayed with him, you know, and we went back to our distributors, who located a small studio for us, and we went up to that studio. We booked some time, and that's when we made what was to become Historic Recordings.
In 1970, the company would re-release the session. It was the last studio recording for blind Willie McTell. He was turning more and more to gospel music, singing spirituals over local radio stations. He did a stint as a guest preacher at Mount Zion Baptist Church. This religious bent did not keep him from drinking. Over the next 5 years, his health began to fail, keeping him off the road. He now played drive-in parking lots, selling songs that once turned the blues world upside down for dimes and quarters. He became a shadow on the night streets of Atlanta, and his world began to unwind. But he would have one last word.
Well, I had a friend who was an artist, and he came by after work one day. We got to talking, and he said, you know, you've expressed an interest in indigenous American music, and he said, I think I found something that you'll be interested in. So he took me for a ride in his new car, and we went down Ponce de Leon to the Blue Lantern, and we went into the back where it was all dark, and it was sort of like a lover's lane back there. And the only person around who was walking around was Willie. And he was sort of a strolling troubadour, and he was working for tips in the back parking lot of the Blue Lantern. I was impressed by his style of playing, so I came back when I could over the next several weeks until one night I asked him if he would make a tape for me, and he said no, he wasn't interested in doing any recording. He'd done recording and had always come to grief. And one night we came back, we were listening to him, and he was pretty drunk that night, and I hung around, and he collapsed and fell over. So I put him in the back of the car. I had a Ford station wagon at the time, and some of the people inside told us where they thought he lived. You know, at that time, the sections of the city were divided up into different sections that we knew about, but the blacks had their own names. They called it like 4th Ward and Mechanicsville, and guy would tell you he would have lived in Mechanicsville. You didn't know where Mechanicsville was. But he lived, if memory serves me, under a place called, of all things, the Dixie Dance Hall. And I think it was late on a Saturday night. We took him back there, and after some commotion in the street over us unloading a body out of the back of a station wagon in the middle of the night, the woman that he stayed with underneath this Dixie Dance Hall in a cellar along the side, it was built on sort of a hill. She came out and testified, to them that he was okay, and we carried him down and we left him there. Well, he woke up and I put some money in his pocket, He woke up the next morning and he found that he had not only the money that his tips, but extra money. And this startled him because he had never passed out before in his life that he hadn't been robbed. Now here he woke up at home. He still had his guitar, he still had his money, and he had more money than he started out with and more than the tips that he'd made. And he had to find, then he went on a quest to find me. So I got a call one day from my mother, who was at that time running my 13th Street store on the corner of 13th and Peachtree, that this gentleman was up there to see me. And you got to understand, this was before desegregation. And that this black man was up there waiting for me with a guitar over his shoulder. And he had walked all the way up there from where he lived, maybe 6 or 7, 8 miles. For a blind person to walk that far to thank me for taking him home. Well, we became more friendly after that. And then one night, we were all sitting around. He said, he says, if you want to, he says, you can turn on the machine and we'll see how it sounds. But you got to play it for me afterwards. But I don't want this ever published while I'm alive, because if I did get any money from it, I would just drink myself to death. And I turned the machine on. It was, it was right behind them. It was in the back of the 13th Street store. And I was there, and a couple of my, close friends were there, and some other people drifted in. And he just played, and he had a bottle, and he drank, and when the tape was over, he listened to it, and we took him home. That was the last that I ever saw him.
Part of the tape was later released under the title Last Session, and indeed it was. In the autumn of 1958, Helen died after a brief illness. Willie was once again on his own. After Helen's funeral, he traveled to Statesboro to see some family and friends. When he left for Atlanta, he forgot his guitar. His health continued to decline, and in the spring of 1959, he suffered a stroke. One of his cousins drove to Atlanta and found him sitting on the back porch steps of the house on Dimmick Street, looking sick and befuddled. He took him home to Thompson. Willie's health improved under the care of his kin in the country. His speech returned, and he picked up his guitar once again, playing for people who passed along the road by the house. But that August, he suffered a second stroke. He was carried to Milledgeville State Hospital, over 50 miles away. A week later, on August 19th, a neighbor who had a telephone drove to the McTeers with the news that Willie McTell had passed away. He was buried in Jones Grove Cemetery outside Thompson. The stone carver mistakenly carved the name of the father he'd barely known on his grave marker. He had asked Kate to make sure that when he went, one of his guitars was buried with him. But she had been notified neither of the death nor the funeral. All Willie's possessions were stored next door to the McTeers. But the house burned down soon after, and everything he had owned was gone. He had died alone. And the few remaining fragments that made up his life had been turned to ashes. But the music The music went on.